Hey guys, it's Shaunak, and just yesterday Apple had their Apple event unleashing the new M1 Pro and M1 Max chips, and also with new AirPods 3, new colors in HomePod Mini, and also a new voice only Apple Music subscription plan. But today we are focusing on the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips with the newly redesigned 14 and 16-inch Macbook Pros. So let's begin. There are actually a few tidbits which Apple didn't tell us, and we'll just start with the first one. So the first one is that the 16-inch MacBook Pro, when you choose the M1 Max chip model, is actually 0.1 pound heavier than the M1 Pro 16-inch MacBook Pro, new 16-inch MacBook Pro, which has the M1 Pro chip. So this basically means that the 16-inch M1 Max chip variant of the 16-inch MacBook, new 16-inch MacBook Pro has better cooling systems. But if you look at the 14-inch, the weight is the same between the M1 Pro chip variant of the new 14-inch MacBook Pro and the M1 Max chip variant, which when you choose that in the 14-inch MacBook Pro. So this is one thing, and if you see that, I really think that the extra weight is because Apple had more room to play around with the cooling system in the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and that means that it could have better cooling systems and better performance overall in the 16-inch MacBook Pro when chosen with the M1 Max chip variant. And this takes me on to the second tidbit, which is actually that it's not just about the weight which is different. It's also that Apple just talked about two chip variants, 10-core CPU with 16-core GPU in the M1 Pro chip, and M1 Max chip has the same 10 cores of CPU with 8 performance and 2 efficiency, which is the same in the M1 Pro. 10 core are both same in both, but the M1 Pro has up to 16 core GPU. The M1 Max has up to 32 core GPU. Apple just talked about these two variants, but that's not true. There are a lot more variants to choose from, and the first variant, the 14-inch MacBook Pro, is not the promised 10-core CPU with 16-core GPU. It's not that. It has 8 CPU cores with 14 GPU cores. So they binned 2 GPU cores and 2 CPU performance cores. So that means in the 8-core CPU model in the 14-inch MacBook Pro, which is only in the 14-inch MacBook Pro, there are 6 performance cores and 2 efficiency cores. So 2 less performance cores in the 8-core CPU model. Now the next variant is 10-core CPU, which is the promise which Apple gave, but this one also means it has a full-fledged 10-core CPU, but it still has a 2 binned GPU cores. So in this case, it has the full-fledged 10-core CPU, but the 14-core GPU. The next chip variant is the full-fledged 10-core CPU with the 16-core GPU, the full-fledged which Apple promised. And this one, there is not anything different. It's the chip variant which Apple talked about. And the other two variants are about the M1 Max chip. So the next one is about that it has the same 10-core CPU as the M1 Pro chip, and the M1 Max chip have the same 10-core CPU, but in the GPU now with the 10-core CPU and 24 core GPU. So it is not the promised 32. Basically 8 GPU cores were built, and now you have a 10 core CPU with a 24 core GPU, and the other one is the full fat 10 core CPU with the 32 core GPU, and that is what Apple talked about. And the next tidbit in which leads me from here is that actually in the M1 Pro variant you can either choose 16 gigabytes of RAM or 32 gigabytes of RAM, whereas in the M1 it started from 8 gigabytes and it maxed out at 16 gigabytes. But in the M1 Pro it starts from 16 gigabytes in any model, any chip variant, but when you choose the M1 Max, it automatically also moves from 16 gigabyte to the 32 gigabyte model. So in the M1 Max chip variant, there are only 2 RAM options available, which is 2 memory options available, which is 32 gigabytes and 64 gigabytes. So if you're adding on $400 for the M1 Max chip, then it's actually going to be 600, because 400 for M1 Pro to M1 Max and an extra 200 for 16 gigabyte to 32 gigabyte, and you can't choose out of that. The new MacBooks can charge up to 50% in 30 minutes fast charge, but the full fast charging is only when you use the MagSafe 3 port. And yes, when there's only one 140 watt big charger for the 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is in the box. So fast charging is not a problem in 16-inch. You do get it in the box, but in the 14-inch, when you buy the base 8-core CPU with 14-core GPU model, actually, like, there are two power adapter options which you can choose from: the 67 watt adapter and the 96 watt adapter. So the 67 watt adapter does not allow fast charge, and also it is only included in the 8-core CPU with the 14-core GPU. But when you go on to a higher specification of the M1 Pro chip, which for example is the 10-core CPU with the 14-core GPU, the 96 watt adapter is pre-included and you can't change back to the 67. You can actually add on the 96 watt adapter, which you do have to keep in mind, because that is only then do you get the faster charging. So this is the next part, and I'm actually pretty disappointed. Apple did bring back many ports, including the SD card and the HDMI mainly, but the HDMI actually is not the full-fledged HDMI 2.1 like in the new Apple TV, which they announced in April. It's actually the older version. I think it's HDMI 2.0, and this only supports, in Apple's website, it says that it only supports for 4K and 60 Hz. And also Apple didn't really tell anything about what the speeds are and what the version is of the SD card slot. So that really has to just be tested. I hope it's a new SD card slot which provides up to 700 megabytes per second speeds, but if it's not, then it's really bad actually. One more thing which is about the connectivity is that it doesn't have Wi-Fi 6E, the new generation of Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth 5.2. It has the normal standard Bluetooth 5.0 and Wi-Fi 6, and that is really not that future proof. And the last part is battery life. So the 14-inch MacBook Pro, which I'll start with, does have a bigger battery. It has a bigger battery, but the battery performance is not as good as the M1 MacBook Pro. So the M1 MacBook Pro had up to 20 hours of battery life, but the 14-inch MacBook Pro has up to 17 hours of battery life, whereas the 16-inch MacBook Pro has up to 21 hours of battery battery life, and that is the longest battery life ever on a Mac. But it's just 1 hour more than the M1, and yes, it is not a lot because these are much more. It is power efficient, but I mean it is still power hungry, and also it has new mini LED, 1000 nits of sustained brightness, 120 Hz per motion, and yeah, the battery is a little bit worse, not as expected, but yeah, it is fine. Hope you like this video. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe. Bye.